The horse kept slamming into the fence, not to escape, but as if it would rather break itself than belong to anyone. A proud millionaire called it untamable. Most men tried to conquer it, and failed. But one quiet stranger did something no one expected. He opened the gate and walked away. What happened next wasn't about control. It was about something far harder to understand. The horse kept slamming into the fence, not to escape, but as if it would rather break itself than belong to anyone. The sound carried across the yard in hollow echoes, metal against bone, a dull rhythm that made even the wind seem to hesitate. Dust rose in quiet bursts beneath the animal's hooves, drifting through the fading light like something trying to disappear before it was seen. Most of the men kept their distance. They stood along the outer fence line, hands resting on worn wood, hats pulled low, not out of respect, but because none of them wanted to be the one the horse noticed next. It wasn't fear in the usual sense. They had seen wild horses before. They had been thrown, kicked, dragged through dirt and pride more times than they cared to count. But this was different. The horse wasn't fighting them. It wasn't even looking at them. It was fighting something no one else could see. Midnight ash struck the fence again, harder this time. The steel groaned under the impact. A streak of dark red marked the animal's shoulder, where the metal had already cut through its coat. Still, it didn't stop. It backed away only long enough to gather itself, then lunged forward once more, like a creature that had decided pain was better than surrender. "Why won't it quit?" one of the younger hands muttered. No one answered, because the truth was, they didn't think it wanted to. At the far side of the yard, Harold Whitaker stood with his hands resting in his coat pockets, watching the scene unfold with a calm that didn't quite belong to the moment. The man had built everything here from nothing but land and decisions. His barns stood straight, his fences held firm, his horses ran fast and clean, everything followed order, everything made sense. Except this one. Midnight ash had been brought down from the high ridges weeks ago, thin, exhausted, half-starved from whatever it had fled before it was caught. At first, Harold had seen promise in it, strength, endurance, the kind of spirit that could be shaped into something valuable. But the horse had never bent. It hadn't learned. It hadn't even tried. It simply refused. "Open the side gate," Harold said quietly, not taking his eyes off the animal. One of the ranch hands hesitated. "You sure, sir?" Harold gave a small nod. The man moved reluctantly, unlatching the smaller section of the fence that led into the outer pen. The metal clicked softly as it shifted open. Midnight ash didn't move toward it, didn't even look. Instead, the horse turned slightly, breathing hard, its sides rising and falling beneath the dark sheen of its coat. For a moment, just a moment, it stood still, and in that stillness, something became clear. The horse knew the gate was open. It simply didn't care. Harold narrowed his eyes. "That's not fear," he said under his breath. No one replied, but a few of the older men along the fence exchanged quiet looks. They had seen stubborn animals before. They had seen broken ones, too. This wasn't either. This was something else. By late afternoon, word had spread beyond the property. People came not because they believed the story, but because they wanted to see if it could possibly be true. A horse that didn't want to be tamed wasn't unusual. A horse that refused even the chance to leave. That was something else entirely. They gathered along the outer rails, murmuring in low voices, waiting for something to happen that would make sense of what they were seeing. Harold stepped forward, just enough for his voice to carry. "Most of you have heard by now," he said, his tone steady, measured. "This horse was taken from the mountains, stronger than anything I've owned." He paused, glancing briefly toward the animal. "And I'll be honest with you." Another quiet thud echoed behind him as midnight ash shifted again, restless but no longer striking. "I haven't found a man who can handle him." A few men chuckled, though it sounded uncertain. Harold continued, his voice sharpening just slightly. But I don't believe there's anything born into this world that can't be brought under control. The words settled over the crowd like dust in still air. Some nodded, others said nothing. Behind him the horse lowered its head, not in submission, but as if the weight of the day had finally pressed down on it, in a way no fence ever could. The wind moved through the valley then, soft and steady, brushing past the barn walls and across the open fields beyond. And for the first time since it had been brought here, Midnight Ash didn't charge the fence. It simply stood there, breathing, watching nothing, as if waiting for something no one else had yet understood. Whatever it was the horse had been waiting for. It did not come that evening. The light faded the way it always did across the valley, slow, deliberate, leaving behind a quiet that felt heavier than the day itself. One by one, the onlookers drifted away, their boots scraping softly against the dirt, their voices lowered as if they had witnessed something they couldn't quite explain. The yard returned to its usual stillness, though something unseen seemed to linger behind. Midnight Ash remained inside the enclosure. It did not move toward the open gate. It did not test the fence again. It simply stood, its dark shape blending into the long shadows, its breathing steady but distant, like a presence that hadn't fully decided to remain. Harold watched a while longer before turning back toward the house. There was nothing left to prove that day, nothing left to control. But not everyone left. At the far edge of the yard, where the last stretch of fence met the open land beyond, a man had remained unnoticed through most of the gathering. He had not leaned forward like the others, had not spoken, or laughed, or questioned what he saw. He had simply watched. Now, as the final wagon wheels disappeared down the road, he stepped closer. Daniel Reeves did not carry himself like a man looking for attention. His coat was worn at the seams, his boots marked by long miles rather than careful work. There was no urgency in his movement, no trace of performance. He approached the outer fence and rested his hands lightly against the wood, his eyes fixed not on the structure, but on the horse within it. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Daniel sat down. Not on a crate, not on a rail, just on the ground, as if the distance between himself and the animal mattered more than anything he might say or do. A ranch hand, still lingering near the barn, noticed him. "You waiting for something?" the man asked. Daniel shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "Just staying a while." The answer didn't invite conversation, and none followed. The night settled in around them without announcement. A thin wind moved across the field, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant pine. Somewhere beyond the ridge a coyote called once, then fell silent again. Midnight Ash shifted its weight. The sound of hooves against dirt was softer now, less restless. The horse turned slightly, not toward the man, but not away from him either. Its ears flicked once, catching something unfamiliar in the air. Daniel did not look up. He kept his gaze low, his posture relaxed, as though he had no expectation of being noticed. Time passed. No one marked it. The stars came slowly, one by one, pressing faint light into the darkening sky. The ranch lights dimmed behind them as the last of the workers finished their tasks and disappeared into the quiet of their routines. Still, Daniel remained. He did not speak to the horse in any way the ear could catch. If there were words, they belonged to a place softer than sound. Once, he lifted his hand slightly, not toward the animal, but as if remembering something that had already passed. Then he let it fall again. Inside the enclosure, Midnight Ash took a step. Not toward the gate, not toward the fence. Just a step. It lowered its head slightly, nostrils flaring as it drew in the air. The tension that had once coiled tightly through its body had loosened, though not disappeared. It was still alert, still ready, but no longer striking. Daniel shifted his weight on the ground, stretching one leg slowly, the movement unforced and unhurried. He leaned back on his hands, looking not at the horse, but at the sky above the valley. "You don't have to," he murmured. The words were barely there, carried more by breath than voice, and yet something in the space between them seemed to notice. Midnight Ash blinked. The horse turned its head just enough to bring the man into view. Not directly, not fully, but in the quiet way animals watch what they are unsure of. Daniel didn't return the gaze. He let the moment pass without holding it. The wind softened. Another stretch of silence followed, deeper now, less uncertain. Then, slowly, so slowly it might have been missed if anyone else had been watching, the horse lowered its body. Not fully, not in surrender, but enough. One knee bent, then the other. Midnight Ash eased itself closer to the ground, its frame still tense, as if ready to rise again at the smallest sign of danger. But it did not rise. It stayed there, breathing. The sound of it filled the space between them. Not loud, not heavy, just present in a way it had not been before. Daniel glanced over then, just once. He didn't move closer, didn't speak again. He simply nodded, almost to himself, and looked away. As if the moment didn't belong to him, as if it never had. The night deepened, and somewhere within it, without witness, without applause, something shifted. Not in the horse alone, but in the space it had finally allowed to exist. The ground held the shape of the horse long after it had settled, as if even the earth needed time to accept what had just happened. Daniel did not move closer. He remained where he was, leaning back against his hands, his presence quiet and unclaimed. There was no attempt to follow what the horse had offered, no reaching for something that might have turned fragile trust into retreat. He understood. Some things only come when they are not asked for. Midnight Ash stayed low, its body half resting, half ready, caught between instinct and something softer that it did not yet recognize. Its breathing slowed, each rise and fall less guarded than before, though never careless. The horse's eyes remained open, reflecting faint fragments of starlight, watching the edges of the world rather than its center. Time drifted. At some point, the wind shifted direction, slipping down from the higher ground beyond the valley. It carried with it a colder air, brushing lightly against both man and animal, settling into the spaces where warmth had begun to gather. Daniel pulled his coat tighter, but did not stand. He glanced once toward the fence, not measuring distance, not calculating risk, simply acknowledging the boundary that still existed. And his gaze returned to the open sky. "You can keep it," he said quietly, though it wasn't clear what he meant. The words faded almost as soon as they were spoken. Inside the enclosure, Midnight Ash shifted again, this time not from tension, but from something closer to fatigue. One of its front legs extended slightly, stretching into the dirt before settling once more. The movement was small, but it carried a kind of permission that had not been there before. Daniel noticed, but he did nothing with it. The silence between them deepened, not empty, not strained, but steady. It was the kind of silence that does not ask to be filled, that allows each moment to arrive without being shaped. Hours passed without measure. At some point, Daniel closed his eyes. Not fully asleep, not fully aware, just resting in the same way the land itself seemed to rest at night. His breathing fell into rhythm with the quiet around him, slow and even, unguarded in a way few men ever allowed themselves to be. The horse listened. It lifted its head slightly, ears turning toward the sound. Not sharp, not alarmed, just curious in a way it had not been before. The human presence it had resisted all day now existed without pressure, without demand, without expectation. Midnight Ash rose. Not abruptly, not in defense, but carefully, unfolding itself from the ground with a measured strength that spoke more of caution than fear. It stood still for a moment, adjusting to the weight of its own body again, then took a step forward. The dirt shifted beneath its hooves. Another step followed. Slow, intentional, not toward the gate, toward the man. Daniel remained still. If he noticed, he did not show it. The distance between them shortened, one quiet movement at a time. The horse stopped several feet away, its head slightly lowered, nostrils flaring as it drew in the scent of something unfamiliar. Not the smell of a threat, not the sharpness of control, but something quieter, something unclaimed. The horse hesitated. Its muscles tightened briefly, as if memory had returned to remind it of what closeness had once meant. Its ears flicked back, then forward again. Daniel exhaled softly. The sound was steady, unforced. And that was all. Midnight Ash stepped closer. Close enough now to see the lines in the man's face, the stillness in his hands, the absence of anything that might try to take from it what it was not ready to give. The horse lowered its head, not in submission, but in recognition of something it did not yet understand. For a brief moment, it stood there, neither retreating nor advancing further, caught between instinct and a quiet curiosity that had begun to outweigh it. Then, slowly, it turned away. Not out of fear, not out of rejection, but as if it had reached the edge of something and chosen, for now, not to cross it. Daniel opened his eyes. He watched the horse return to the center of the enclosure, its movements calm, deliberate, no longer driven by the urgency that had once defined it. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. Not victory, not relief, just acknowledgement. "You don't need me," he said softly. The words carried no disappointment, only truth. The sky had begun to lighten slightly at the horizon, the first hint of dawn pressing gently against the darkness. The night, which had held everything in quiet suspension, was beginning to release its hold. Daniel pushed himself to his feet slowly, brushing the dust from his coat. He did not look back again. He walked away the same way he had come, without announcement, without leaving anything behind that could be claimed or followed. Inside the enclosure, Midnight Ash remained still, watching. Not the man, but the space he had occupied. Morning did not arrive gently. It came with noise, boots on gravel, voices cutting through the quiet, the clatter of gates and metal as the ranch returned to its privish routine. The stillness of the night dissolved quickly, as if it had never truly belonged to this place. Midnight Ash stood near the center of the enclosure, unmoving. Its gaze drifted across the yard, not searching, not restless, but aware in a way that had changed since the night before. Something in its posture had softened, though nothing about it suggested surrender. Harold Whitaker noticed immediately. He paused just outside the fence, studying the horse with a narrowed focus. The marks along its shoulder were still there, but the wild urgency that had once driven it into the rails had faded into something quieter. "That's new," one of the men beside him said. Harold didn't respond. He stepped closer. "Bring him out," he said. There was no hesitation this time. Two ranch hands moved to the gate, opening it wide enough to guide the horse into the larger yard. One of them carried a rope, though he held it loosely, uncertain whether it would be needed or survive the attempt. Midnight Ash did not charge. It did not retreat either. It walked, slowly, carefully, as if measuring each step against something unseen. The men exchanged glances. "Think it's finally ready?" one asked under his breath. Harold's expression remained unchanged. "We'll see." A small crowd had begun to gather again, drawn by the same quiet curiosity as before, but now sharpened by expectation. Word had traveled faster than truth, and by morning the story had already begun to shift into something else. A challenge, a claim, a test. Harold turned to face them, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "I said yesterday there wasn't a man who could handle this horse," he began. A few heads nodded, a few leaned closer. He let the silence stretch just long enough. "Today, I'm willing to be proven wrong." A murmur moved through the crowd. Harold reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a folded slip of paper. Not money, not a contract, just something symbolic enough to give weight to what came next. Anyone who can ride him, he continued, his tone calm but edged, walks away with more than just a story. The words settled heavily. It wasn't about the reward. It was about the moment, about being the one who could do what others could not. The first man stepped forward almost immediately, tall, confident, carrying himself with the kind of certainty that comes from experience rather than reflection. He approached the horse with practiced ease, rope in hand, movements deliberate. Midnight Ash watched him. Still, the man reached out, not quickly, not aggressively, but with intention. The moment his fingers brushed against the horse's neck, everything changed. The stillness shattered. Midnight Ash recoiled, not in panic, but in rejection so immediate and absolute it left no room for misunderstanding. Its body surged backward, muscles tightening, hooves striking against the dirt with a force that sent dust rising in sharp bursts. The man stumbled, barely regaining his footing before stepping away. A second attempt followed, then a third, each one ending the same. Not violence, not chaos, but refusal, clear, unmistakable. The crowd grew quieter with each failed approach. Something about it no longer felt like a challenge. It felt like a boundary. Harold's jaw tightened slightly. "Next," he said. Another man stepped forward, then another. Each one trying a different approach, firmer grip, softer voice, slower movement. Techniques shaped by years of experience, confidence built on past success. None of it mattered. Midnight Ash did not strike the fence, did not lash out. It simply denied them, over and over again, as if the answer had already been decided long before they arrived. By midday, the air had grown heavy with heat and something less visible, something closer to unease. The crowd had thinned, though not entirely. Those who remained no longer spoke as much. They watched, waiting for something to break. Harold turned away briefly, scanning the edge of the yard. And that was when he saw him. Daniel Reeves stood at the far side, just beyond the outer fence, exactly where he had been the evening before. His posture unchanged, his presence quiet enough that most had not even noticed he was there. Harold studied him for a moment, then gestured. "You," he called out. The word carried, cutting cleanly through the space between them. Daniel didn't move right away, not out of hesitation, but as if he hadn't expected to be called at all. A few heads turned. The crowd shifted slightly, curiosity returning in a different form now, not directed at the horse, but at the man who had yet to step forward. "You've been standing there long enough," Harold said. "Might as well see what you can do." Daniel stepped closer, not toward the horse, toward the fence. He rested his hand against the wood, the same way he had the night before. "I'm not here for that," he said quietly. Harold's expression hardened just slightly. "Everyone's here for something." Daniel shook his head. "No," he replied. "Not like this." The answer didn't land the way Harold expected. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The crowd waited. The horse stood still, and something in the air, something that had been building since morning, shifted again, though no one could yet say why. Harold exhaled slowly, then folded the paper back into his coat. "Suit yourself," he said. But his eyes didn't leave Daniel, not even as he turned away. Inside the yard, Midnight Ash lowered its head slightly, not in exhaustion, not in defeat, but as if the noise of the day had passed through it without leaving anything behind. The challenge had been spoken. The answer had already been given, just not in the way anyone had expected. The yard did not return to noise after that. It held a strange kind of quiet, the kind that comes not from absence, but from something being understood without being spoken. A few men shifted their weight along the fence, uncertain whether to stay or leave. Others looked down, as if the ground beneath them might offer an explanation that no one else could. Harold Whitaker remained still. For a man who had built his life on certainty, this moment did not offer him anything he could measure, control, or reshape. And yet he did not step away. Not yet. Daniel stood where he was, one hand resting lightly against the wood, his attention no longer fixed on the horse alone, but on the space around it, the space that had been filled with noise, expectation, and something closer to demand. Now, it was empty again. Midnight Ash lifted its head, its ears turned, not toward the crowd, not toward the open field, but toward the man who had refused to enter. There was no urgency in the movement, no visible shift that would have drawn attention from those who were still watching. But something had changed, not in the way people might recognize, not in a way that could be proven. The horse took a step. The sound of its hoof against the dirt was soft, almost lost beneath the weight of the silence that followed. Another step came after, unhurried, deliberate, untouched by the tension that had filled the yard only moments before. The crowd did not react. Perhaps they did not yet understand what they were seeing. Midnight Ash moved closer to the fence, closer to the place where Daniel stood. Harold noticed. His gaze sharpened slightly, but he said nothing. Daniel did not move. He did not straighten his posture, did not lift his hand, did not call the horse in any way. He simply remained, unchanged, uninviting, present in the same quiet way he had been since the night before. The horse stopped a few feet away, its breathing steady, its body still. For a moment the world seemed to narrow to that single distance between them. Not wide, not small, just enough to matter. Daniel exhaled softly. Not a signal, not a command, just breath. Midnight Ash lowered its head, slowly, carefully, not as submission, not as surrender, but as if something within it had finally grown tired of holding itself apart. The horse stepped closer, close enough now that the space between them no longer needed to be measured. Daniel lifted his hand, not toward the horse, but upward, briefly, as if reminding himself of something he had nearly forgotten. Then, gently, he let it rest against the top of the fence. He did not reach across, did not close the distance. Midnight Ash did. Its nose brushed lightly against the wood. Then, after a moment that stretched longer than it should have, it leaned just enough to touch the back of Daniel's hand. The contact was brief, barely there. But it held. No one spoke. The crowd, what remained of it, seemed to understand without needing explanation that what they were witnessing was not something they had come for, and not something they could take with them. Harold took a step forward, then stopped. There was nothing for him to claim here. No proof of dominance, no victory to announce. The paper in his coat pocket felt heavier now, though it meant less than it had that morning. Daniel let his hand remain where it was. He did not turn it into more, did not curl his fingers, did not try to guide or hold. After a moment, Midnight Ash pulled back. Not sharply, not in retreat, just enough. The horse lifted its head again, its eyes no longer distant, no longer fixed on something beyond reach. It stood there, steady and unguarded in a way that had nothing to do with control. Daniel stepped away from the fence. No hesitation, no lingering glance. He turned, brushing the dust from his coat once more, and began to walk toward the open road beyond the ranch. Harold watched him go. "You're not even going to try," he called out, though his voice lacked the sharpness it once carried. Daniel paused, only for a second. Then he shook his head. "You don't try with something like that," he said. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "You either leave it alone, or you learn to stand where it can come to you." Harold said nothing. There was no argument left in him. Daniel continued walking. The distance between him and the ranch grew slowly, quietly, until he became just another figure along the road, unclaimed, unnamed by anyone who remained behind. Inside the yard, Midnight Ash turned. Not toward the fence, not toward the open gate, but toward the wide stretch of land beyond, where the horizon lay untouched by ownership or expectation. The wind moved through its mane, soft and steady. For a moment, it stood there. Then it walked. Not running, not escaping, just moving forward, step by step, into a space that no longer asked anything of it. And for the first time since it had been brought down from the mountains, it did not look back. Some things in life were never meant to be owned, only understood. This story isn't about taming a horse, but about learning when to stop forcing and start listening. If this moment stayed with you, there are more stories waiting, quiet, human, and real in the ways that matter most.
If this story meant something to you, share your thoughts below. And don't forget to like and subscribe to Horse Heart Healing for more stories like this.